Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Autism Ontario summer sessions. We're really excited to be hosting Ed Mahony, and he's going to walk us through 3 specific sessions around understanding the IPRC. My name is Catherine Buchan, and I am the Education Materials Coordinator for Autism Ontario, and I'm just going to update you with a couple of housekeeping details. So a few housekeeping details. The idea behind these webinars was to provide families with information around how to navigate the IPRC process. Ed has divided up the content into 3 specific sessions, one focusing on what to do leading up to your IPRC, one focusing specifically on the IPRC process itself, and the last one focusing on what you can do after your IPRC is over. There are a list of resources that will be available to you throughout each webinar. We encourage you to read and use all of them, get a really good sense of what's available, and have a sort of sound understanding around it, because that will help direct you and lead you into the kinds of questions you want to ask Ed. We're going to be providing you with 2 specific ways to connect with Ed throughout the webinars. The first is if you want to type your question into the question box, we can answer it that way live after each webinar session, or you can do it through Twitter using the hashtag #MakeYourIPRCReal. You can see that on the slide deck right now, tagging in Autism Ontario and Ed Mahony, and you can put your question up on Twitter and we can have a live conversation about it that way as well too. Ed, we're so excited to have you here with us, helping families get ready for this fall and school year. And I guess one of the first things that you talk about is really inviting families to understand the rules. What do you mean by that?
Well, let me give a little bit of context to this. In my work as advocating and supporting parents, I find that families often feel very anxious and sometimes angry about not being heard in schools. And this anger and this anxiety sometimes can lead to, how could we put it, an unfruitful relationship with the school. And what I found is that if we can show parents where their rights are, where they can be heard, it tends to lower anxiety and just makes for a more positive relationship with the school. And if we look at Ontario educational regulations, the single best place to look for where parents can be heard is in what is termed the Individual Placement and Review Committee process.
So that's the IPRC.
It's rare that you actually hear those 4 words. I'm pretty sure some people don't actually know what it stands for. But that is where we find the vast majority of parental rights.
So what you're really talking about is empowering families. And I know you put together a case study about a little girl named Emily, and you're going to show us a couple of different ways that we can think about this process working.
Yes. One of the issues when talking about advocacy, particularly around autism, is that, in a word, autism is complicated. The diagnosis tends to change over time, how we understand it. There's many traits. I found that when I'm explaining the IPRC process, the easiest way to do it is to look at a child with what I would term a single trait need. So we're going to look at the case of Emily. I've known many children like Emily. Emily is visually impaired.
Okay.
Emily cannot see. Her vision impairment is profound. So we can all understand what we're dealing with. A simple scenario like this allows your common sense to sort of see the answer.
Right.
And then we'll talk about ASD.
Okay.
So Emily comes to a school community from another province. She walks in the door with her mother. Her mother's enrolling her in grade 1. Emily can't see. And what does the school do?
Right.
So the very instructive and useful thing about talking about a child with a visual impairment is it's clear what needs to happen. She's walked in the door. She's visually impaired. The school has to provide programs and services from that moment on. This school did a really good job. The principal came out, they walked her to the class, they found there was an educational assistant, and they've retasked her to temporarily be with Emily, and the special ed teacher is spending time with her, and they're showing her the school, and the mother wanted to talk to the principal, and the principal made time, canceled other things because the principal realized that this had to be attended to. The school and their actions have observed their obligations under the Education Act, where they have an obligation to provide schooling to this child before there is any IPRC.
Right.
The school is also obligated to provide services on the basis of disability under Ontario Human Rights Code. The school's also really taken to heart some messages from a wonderful document called Shared Solutions, which you can look on the resource link at, which talks about schools and parents collaborating in the best interests of a child.
Right.
To be in school is, in a sense, the first regulatory right. Now, I could imagine a situation where a child who had a profound medical issue the school might need a few days to set up the appropriate things so that the child is safe.
Mm-hmm.
But by and large, the child should be in school. Mm-hmm. Now we're looking at, we're moving forward. The mother's very, very happy. The principal's engaged with the mother, the child's in class. There's not a lot of programming or services at this point because, they just arrived, but they're really, really trying. And they're talking about bringing in people from the board, and mom's having a lot of good conversations. But a few weeks pass, and the mother talks to the special ed resource teacher and asks when the IPRC will be. Because, Emily's mother is very knowledgeable and she knows about IPRCs. And initially, the special ed teacher is a bit taken aback because the tradition in this board is that will be done at the end of the year. And she says, well, that normally we do them at the end of the year. And the mother says, well, I understand that that's your tradition, but I think I'd like to have the IPRC now, so I will speak to the principal about that.
Right.
The piece of legislation that covers the ability of a parent to request an IPRC is Regulation 181/98. And you can read all about that within our resource section, and I suspect you'll be reading a lot about that. But it does specify that it has to be a letter, and it has to be in writing to the principal. It's not enough to have a conversation. So the mother writes a letter asking for an IPRC, and she's very, very careful in the letter to be as positive as possible and talk about the good things that are happening. And about a week later, the special ed teacher calls her, and she says there'll be an envelope coming home in Emily's backpack from the principal. And she waits and opens the envelope, and in the envelope there's a letter that acknowledges her request for an IPRC. And it says approximately when it's going to be, and it looks like it's going to be in about 6, 7, 8 weeks when they can organize it. And it also has something called a parent's guide to special ed programs and services. This is a requirement within the regulation that a school must send a parent the first time that an IPRC is requested, and it gives all the basic information about IPRCs and special ed in general. So far, we've talked about 3 regulatory rights or responsibilities that affect a parent. The first, the right of your child to be in school. The second, the right to request an IPRC. And thirdly, the obligation of a school to respond to the request. And in this particular situation, the school response has been great. Now we're going to just look at a fourth piece that I'd like to add. Emily's mother, while she's waiting for the IPRC, is reading about how to advocate for her child. And she realizes that she has a lot of documents about Emily, but perhaps the school has different documents. Maybe they have things that she doesn't have. So she goes to school and she talks to the secretary and she requests to see Emily's Ontario student record. A little bit of information for people that haven't heard of this. Every student in Ontario has an Ontario student record, and it has most of the documents that follow you through school. Report cards, letters, everyone has one. Well, Emily's mother's asking to see it, and this doesn't come up a lot in the school. And so the secretary says, well, let me talk to the principal. And again, she gets a call from the secretary saying, come on in the next day. And Emily's mother and the resource teacher spend about an hour in the afternoon looking through Emily's OSR, which is rather thin because she's only been in school for a year. And Emily sees that there's a report, Emily's mother sees there's a report she doesn't have. So she asks the school to make a copy of it for her, and the school complies, and that's the end of that interaction. But again, the school has complied with their obligation under regulation to allow Emily's mother to view that OSR.
Right.
And to provide copies of material if so requested. Another week passes and a letter arrives at the school. Emily's mother has written a letter to the school talking about how she imagines the upcoming IPRC. And she's talking about how she really, really wants to focus on needs that are evidence-based and proven about Emily. And she also wants to talk about the programs and services that Emily requires to meet those needs. Around the needs, Emily's mother has talked about several things. She's talked about, obviously, Emily's visually impaired, but she's also talking about Emily as having major safety needs. And she's talking about Emily as having major mobility needs because she can't walk around the class or school. And she's suggesting several programs and services that would meet these needs based on medical reports that have been written about Emily. And this letter initially strikes the principal as unusual because this particular school board, and many school boards, often treat the IPRC as somewhat of a rubber stamp.
Right.
To be honest, that it could be done in 5 minutes. And Emily's mother is clearly not seeing it in that way. So the principal, though, is conflicted on this because Emily's mother has only been positive and very cooperative, and her tone in the letter itself is very, very positive. So the principal sends a copy to the letter to her superintendent, and they talk about it. And it turns out that everything that Emily's mother is asking to do is actually a regulatory right inside the Education Act. That these are all things that a parent could ask for and that school boards are required to do by regulation. And so the principal then calls Emily's mother about 2 weeks before the actual IPRC is going to happen and gives her the exact time and place, which will be at the school at a certain time. And there's allotted at least about 45 minutes for the meeting because clearly Emily's mother has a lot to talk about. Mm-hmm. And during the conversation, Emily's mother indicates that she's going to come with a few people. She's going to it sounds like she can get the doctor to come. And also she's going to bring a representative that will accompany her to the IPRC to support her and to speak for her, and it will be somebody in the vision impairment community. And this is another request, another thing that the principal has not really dealt with much before. But again, when the principal looks into it, in the legislation, a parent has a right to bring a representative to speak for them and support them. So now it looks like we're ready. We're ready for the IPRC. But in this period of getting ready, Emily's mother has asserted herself 7 times specifically. I'm trying to remember what they all are, Catherine. So first, she's brought her child to school.
Right.
And that in itself is a right. Secondly, she's requested an IPRC.
Yep.
Thirdly, the school has responded as they must. Fourthly, she has asked to see the OSR and she's asked for copies. She has, in the letter to the school, talked about other rights that she has in a soft and positive way, her right to talk about programs and services, which is a 5th thing. The school has contacted the parent within 10 days before the meeting to give the exact time and place in writing. And finally, she's asserted her right to bring a representative.
Right.
So in my mind, she's really set the table for this. She has asserted herself in a positive and assertive way for this meeting that will follow. So to summarize and reiterate where we are, it would be really, really helpful to look at our resource links and really take a look at the material around Regulation 181/98. There's a really nice piece that explains it in layman's language that it's clear for me to read. As well, it would be good to look at a parent's guide to special ed programs and services. Each board has their own. I think the link that I'm using is from the Toronto District School Board, which is the largest board in the country and has really a wonderful parent's guide. And as well as these documents, there's a nice resource called Shared Solutions that was published by the Ministry of Education that really talks about how to work collaboratively with a school and how to solve problems, and we'll be referring to that a lot in the next webinar. And finally, Autism Ontario has a very nice resource, a collection and links to many other resources called Negotiating the Maze.
Yeah.
And I would take some time and look at all 4 of those. In the upcoming session, we're going to be talking more about Emily and the actual rights and responsibilities around an IPRC and what you can ask for. But we're also going to be looking at Madeline. Madeline is also in grade 1, but Madeline is not visually impaired. Madeline has Autism Spectrum Disorder. And we're going to talk about how, in many ways, the rights and arguments are exactly the same, but in many ways they're more complicated and sophisticated because autism is just a much more complex disorder. And we'll probably be talking about other children with ASD that have different profiles. So in the upcoming next 2 webinars, we're going to be looking at a variety of things. We're really going to spend some time looking at ASD and the IPRC in depth because it is a very particular conversation we have to have. And we're really, really going to spend some time trying to understand needs in terms of the IPRC. We're going to look at programs and services, and it's not such an easy thing to do because there's just so many sources. And what that means, because it means sometimes a different thing to school boards than it does to the ministry.
Right.
and we have to somehow bring these two together. We're really going to look at the actual IPRC meeting, you in the meeting, how you act in the meeting, what is a productive way to behave and what's an unproductive way to behave. And finally, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about after the IPRC, what happens after the IPRC, how we move advocacy forward at that point. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the people skills that you need to move things forward. And we're going to talk about other advocacy issues. Just as a side note, doing this webinar, the way I imagine it is that this conversation that we're having here is one level that you can look at, but you need to look at the PowerPoint because it goes a little bit deeper. And then from the PowerPoint, there will be links to much more in-depth information that is fairly clear and specific. And then that information even has links to source material. So you can go as deep as you want with this. And then finally, you can talk to me, in the upcoming ways that we've talked about. I'm quite excited about the Twitter.
Yeah, it's going to be cool. Thank you so much, Ed, for this first of 3 sessions. I know we're so excited to have you, and we're so excited to host this live chat. For those of you live watching and would like to ask Ed some questions, you can ask your questions in the question box on the console. If you're interested in asking a question on Twitter, use the hashtag #MakeYourIPRCReal, and don't forget to tag in Autism Ontario and Ed Mahony on Twitter, and we'll be able to answer your questions for you there. If you want to get in touch with Ed, make sure you visit him at www.mahonyadvocacy.com, and you can get in touch with him directly, or you can get in touch with him through us through the information provided below. We're looking forward to your questions. So Ed, we've got lots of questions that are coming in for you today about your first session with us. We're going to start reading them. A lot of questions have come through the webinar directly. The first one is from a parent who wants to know a question about a child for junior kindergarten. So this parent asks, is it typical to do an IEP before an IPRC meeting for a child entering junior kindergarten, doing the meetings the year prior? So maybe you can give a little look at maybe a timeline for a kiddo entering junior kindergarten and how the IPRC plays a role.
Sure. I mean, every board does this different, but it is very typical, and it's a really good thing that the school is doing an IEP before the IPRC actually happens.
Yes.
First, you couldn't have done an IPRC before the child was in the school. That's right. The way the rules are. And typically, the child has needs. The school's trying to meet the needs, and they're not waiting until the IPRC. They have an ability to write something called a non-exceptional IEP, and that's likely what they've done. So it's actually pretty good practice.
Good practice. Okay, great. So our next question. Is an IPRC updated needed at the beginning of high school or when a psychoeducational... We've got a phone ringing. Sorry, everyone. I'm going to ask that question again. Is an IPRC update needed at the beginning of high school or when a psychoeducational reassessment has been done?
It definitely would be a good idea to have an IPRC review after psychoed has been done, because it might change your knowledge of the child. Typically, it's a really good idea to do an IPRC review every year. I would strongly suggest that. Definitely at the end of grade 8, because the changes between grade 8 and grade 9 as the system works in Ontario are really pronounced.
Right.
But I would widen that really it shouldn't just be at these key pivotal moments. This should be an ongoing thing that you do on a yearly basis. Okay,
great. One sort of similarly along the same lines, more a general one, should every child with autism spectrum disorder have an IPRC?
Well, in my opinion, yes. That would be the first answer, because having the IPRC, as you're starting to see, provides a series of rights to a family that they don't otherwise have in the Education Act. But also, if you actually look at the Education Act and if you look at tribunal decisions, everyone expected that we identify children with a disorder like autism. It was expected. That's how the system is supposed to work. That's how parents are provided the checks and balances.
Right. And I know a lot of the questions that we get from parents around, well, you know, if we have the IEP in place, is that enough?
It's a good first step, but in my opinion, it's not enough.
Okay. We have a question here. Is it typical for a school to request a parent's input to the IEP prior to the draft being written?
It's actually a requirement in the Education Act that, and actually when I speak about the Education Act, I'm referring to a particular regulation that we talked about, 180, 198. The school is obligated to consult with the parents in the creation of an IEP. So yeah, it really, because you know your child, they know your child at school, you know your child at home, it only makes sense to work collaboratively.
Right. I'm just going to jump in really quickly. For those of you that are listening right now, there's a tab at the bottom of your console, and one of the tabs says resource links. In your resource links is the full PowerPoint presentation with a list of resources that Ed has mentioned in the webinar today. It's really important that you take a look at each of those links. They're really quick and easy to click on, so you can get a sense. It's a lot of reading, but they're all very helpful and useful as you navigate this process. So the next question is, coming in around the IPRC and the IEP again, what's the difference between using an IPRC and an IEP to hold your school accountable?
I'd even revisit the words, you know, I like to be positive, so holding school accountable, I think we're all accountable. I think that it shouldn't be viewed as aggressive to expect people to do what they're supposed to do. But with that in mind, the IEP is not a real means to hold someone accountable within the Education Act because the school has the ability to change the IEP in small ways without even consulting with you. And even though we have to consult with you in large changes to the IEP, you really don't have the ability in the regulations to challenge that.
Right.
Your ability to challenge is within the IPRC.
Okay. We've got another question here. How do I go about moving my child from modified to accommodated on his IEP? Do I have to prove anything regarding his skills? He's currently going into grade 7, and I want him to be able to have choices in high school and beyond, and I understand that he will be limited in his choices if he's modified.
Oh, that's interesting and complex questions. It's very hard to answer that question without knowing the child involved, but I can say certain basic things.
Right.
First, there really, by default, is not a connection between modifications in grade 6 or 7 and credits. They're not related in any way, right? But on the other hand, for me to say, how do I get my child to have accommodations and not modifications when I really don't know at the level your child is working, I really can't answer that question. Accommodations assume that a child can work at grade. Modifications often assume, in a practical sense, that they're not doing the full grade load. You do need to know one point about high school, that in some ways, high school is the great reset, right?
Right.
That there's only one stream in grade 6 and 7 and 8. And once we get to grade 9, we have 3 streams, all which are credit bearing. That there are children that might be coming where they're working at something that you would traditionally understand to be a grade 6 or even a grade 5 level, but it's conceivable they could get credits in a high school if in the right stream.
Right.
And maybe we can talk about that in the future,
yeah.
Streams of high schools.
Yeah. Lots of questions that we get from families who speaking different languages. For parents with a language barrier, so their languages other than English, what are their rights in terms of accessing translators? So I would assume this would be for someone going into an IPRC meeting who might not be.
To the best of my knowledge, there's no specific reference to to the need for a board to provide translators inside special ed regulations. But on a broader sense, I think the board has an obligation to provide translators more from a human rights sort of perspective.
Right.
And if we could look at boards, we're sitting in Toronto right now.
Right.
If we look at the TDSB, the Toronto District School Board, they're very good at that.
Right.
This is a reality of a multicultural province.
Right.
So how do you ask for it? You ask for it. And sometimes there might be a community partner that would provide that, but most communities, and they do it all in a slightly different way, have that ability to find somebody that can do it. I would argue that it probably shouldn't be a family member that speaks stronger English because, again, you're tied to it. You need somebody from outside that would be able to do the translation.
Okay. Another question here. How would one approach the IPRC with a child with a dual diagnosis? For example, Autism Spectrum Disorder and another developmental disability.
I'm assuming I'm making a lot of assumptions here, but in one sense, it is no different. You would ask for an IPRC. In most boards, the autism tends to be the diagnosis that we focus on more. Other boards, and I think you're talking about autism and a developmental disability, other boards might have a lot of meaning for them. One way to imagine it, though, is that to have an IPRC, to have a child identified to get into the IPRC process, you only need one diagnosis, right? I mean, what likely would be the IPRC exceptionality would be multiple autism / developmental disability, but either one of those would trip the process and you'd have a child with exceptionality.
Okay. Another question coming in is from actually a parent whose child is 11, getting ready to transition him into high school, and she says that she's had a really sort of rocky relationship with his school. She's had years and years of struggles, and she's wondering how you might suggest going around starting to repair the relationship and getting him ready for high school.
Okay, so we're talking, was this grade 7?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing I think you really want to do is everything we're talking about in this series becomes very, very important to you because in some way entering high school is literally like entering school again.
Right.
You're going to have to learn a lot about high school, secondary, and how it works in your community. Get a really, really strong sense of exactly where your child is in terms of their ability. That is very important. And really start to, maybe even in the grade 8 year, start to make a connection with the high school. Talk to the elementary school a lot about the word transition. It's a requirement now in an IEP. I would even, inside an IPRC, talk about the need for transition planning.
Right.
And then everything in your mind that went bad in elementary school, it's almost time to do a bit of an autopsy on that and really look at how you can approach this in a different way. Probably the way that we'll be talking about in the next two webinars. Right. Because it's a whole new set of personalities in the high school.
Right.
Whole new world.
A fresh start. Okay. If a child in junior kindergarten has an IPRC placement with resource assistance, how much involvement will be expected on a daily / weekly basis from the special education resource teacher? The junior kindergarten, senior kindergarten program in this person's school is all-inclusive, which means their specialized classes do not start until grade 1.
Okay.
So how much involvement will be expected from the resource assistant?
My answer is going to be a bit blurry because the rules are a bit blurry. In the Education Act, there's 5 placements. 3 are inclusive placements. That's the middle of the 3. Indirect service, resource assistance, withdrawal assistance. There is a sense that the resource teacher has a relationship with your child and is doing something with your child and not just consulting with the teacher. How much they're with your child is totally up in the air. Okay. There's no specific number. There would be a sense that if it was if your child was being taken out of class for significant scheduled periods of time, that would be withdrawal assistance. So my sense is it's a fully inclusive placement, and if anything, you have the teacher maybe coming in and supporting your child, supporting the teacher in the class. I know this might not be a satisfactory answer, but that's basically what that term infers.
Before the school year ended, this parent was made aware that there were cuts, that there were going to be cuts made to educational assistant support. This has always been a challenge. However, part of their child's success in mainstream classrooms is to have EA support, and they're wondering what advice you have to ensure that the support continues.
Okay, I'm going to answer this in a few ways.
Yeah.
The first is, it's like we're referring to the thing we're doing.
Right.
You know, for you to have an EA,
Mm-hmm.
for an EA to be with your child,
Mm-hmm.
that's a program and service. That's a service. To get a service such as that, there has to be needs that drive that service.
Right.
And you have to have evidence that your child has these needs.
Right.
So we're sort of back engineering this, and I would ask you, and you have to think about this, why does your child need EA support? Typically, the strongest reasons are safety related or medical related. These are the strongest reasons. There needs to be a reason, and then you would actually consider using the IPRC process to drive this, to demonstrate your child needs support. I'll throw this out too. Many schools will say this is a narrative that you'll hear that children don't really have EAs. Schools have EAs and they assign to children, and at some level that's true.
Yep.
But ultimately, when you bring up evidence-based needs and programs and services that are presently working, it becomes very difficult for us to take that away, and literally impossible to take it away for economic reasons, like we're cutting back on EAs.
Right. Right. I'm just thinking, too, this would be a good point to remind everybody listening that the resources through Autism Ontario, the Negotiating the Maze that Ed referenced, has an entire package around some of these checklists around the supporting documents, and then a letter and a template itself to help parents around writing specifically to their principals about setting up meetings.
And do really follow the next two webinars, because we're really talking about that sort of situation. Like in a nutshell, we've, I think, mentioned the hypothetical little girl named Emily. Okay, Emily's blind. Emily's visually impaired. The board's cutting back. We can't cut back Emily's. We can't cut back support for Emily.
Right.
To the extent that your son or daughter is like Emily in their needs, that they're really clear, it's very, why would we do that?
Right.
It's very difficult.
Right. Next question. My son is going into junior kindergarten. We've had a meeting in the spring with the school and all of his team to talk about his strengths and needs. When I questioned about an IPRC meeting, they said they didn't need to do one since it's an inclusive school. This is something I'm definitely going to pursue more, but when should I request this? First week of school, a month into school, should the IEP be done before this meeting or after?
Was this a child going into junior kindergarten?
Yes, their son is going into junior kindergarten. And they've met with the school already, with the team to talk about strengths and needs, and then when she asked about the IPRC, they said they didn't want to.
Okay. I'll answer this in a few ways.
Right.
I'm putting myself in your situation. You might have a really good situation, right? Because they've met beforehand, they've talked about your child's needs. That's great, and that's a transition meeting that it's mandated now pretty well across the province that those sorts of transition meetings happen. But it seems like they did that, and that was great. They could not have IPRC'd your child yet, because in the legislation you can't IPRC until the child's actually a student in the board, which happens this September. Secondly, many boards will provide amazing support for your child and never IPRC your child.
Right.
And they're really, really good people, and that's how they do their work.
Which is sort of where you were going with Emily as well, too.
And
Mom brought this up.
And the next piece is, they never have to IPRC your child because the legislation doesn't make them do it. On the other hand, if you ask for an IPRC in writing, they're compelled to hold the IPRC. They don't have a choice with that. So when to do it, the fact that they're really cooperating with you, and likely there's going to be some sort of IEP in the fall, an individual education plan. I'd give them a few months. I really would personally, and then I'd probably call it sometime in the winter. Okay. Probably that would be my best bet once they get a sense of who your daughter is, because our son. Why did I think that was that a girl? Once they get a sense of your child, once they get a sense of your child, that gives, then it becomes a more informed meeting. Right. But that's the answer when you ask for it.
Okay. Next question. In the IPRC meeting, our school advised that they could only put 5 needs identified. Is there a limit to identifying needs on the IPRC document? Does this impact the IEP document?
This is always, this comes to a bigger thing, right? Right. Where, and this is I think a lot of parents feel this frustration that, and I'm in no way disparaging teachers, school boards. Lord knows I am one.
You are one.
But when a teacher says something to, for instance, a special ed teacher, that we can only put 5. And again, they're doing that for good reasons. They're assuming we don't want 50 because that becomes unmanageable, right? But is that the teacher's rule or the school's rule or the board's rule? Well, the simple answer to this is there is no limit to needs that can be in an IPRC statement. And when I say that, what I'm saying is that when I actually look at the legislation, which I do, there is no limit. If your child needed this many, it's as many needs as describe your child in sufficient clarity so you can decide what this child needs. But on the other hand, is that really fightable? Do you want to fight that? Could your child be described in 5 needs? We're going to be talking about in the next webinar about programs and services and needs. Right. And we'll talk about that a lot. But, so the way I would answer this is no, there is no limit. On the other hand, you have to decide whether this is something to contest or not based on your child. Okay.
Now, the next question asks, what services, resources can a parent ask for at an IPRC meeting if the child has autism spectrum disorder?
Well, that might be literally our entire next webinar. But the simple answer is you can, first, you have the right to ask for, the language in the Act says you can make proposals about programs and services at an IPRC. Right. And the simple answer is you could propose anything you want. Now, what would be an effective a proposal for programs and services? The first way to imagine it is what is realistic and real and reasonable and is self-evident about your child in terms of programs and services. If your child, for instance, can't talk, the programs and services should have something to do with communication, and that's logical, right? So that's one way of seeing it. And the other way to look at it, and what we'll be looking at it in the webinar to come, is let's look at programs and services that are typically listed in school boards, because they're large. And let's look at programs and services that are sometimes mandated by tribunals and courts, because that tells you the limits of what you can ask for. Okay? So I really, how do I put it? Stay tuned. Yeah. Watch the next webinar and call again.
Join us again. Our next question. Should the consultation for the elaboration of the IEP happen every year?
Yes. It should probably, well, depending on the child, right? I mean, I know some schools maybe only do that once a year in a sort of an IEP that's a very light IEP, but by and large, that consultation can happen all the time. It isn't an event that happens on a day once a year. It definitely has to happen in September. We have an obligation to consult with you, but it should at least, I would imagine it like this. If your board has, every time a report card comes out, I think we're up to, 3 times? And then high school, depending on how you see that. There should probably be a change to the IEP at that time. The consultation should happen several times a year and really should, in more complex situations, be more of a process than like an event on a day. Yeah.
So this is from a mom who's talking about really wanting to start her relationship with the school off in a positive way. And I know we've talked about shared solutions. She said, my child just got a diagnosis. They're entering grade 1, and I want to be positive. I want a good working relationship, but I don't want to get pushed around. Where should I start?
I'm paraphrasing shared solutions, and it would be fun to look at it, and we have it as a link.
Yep.
And I'm trying to remember the word that the document uses, but I'll put it like this. They talk about parents sometimes falling in 2 camps, neither of which are productive. One is to be aggressive. Yeah. And we'll be talking about that. But the other one is they use the word to acquiesce, which is to just not in any way project your concerns. The answer is in the middle, and we'll be talking a lot about that. That you can be positive and forward-thinking and really want relationship, but still be fairly clear and defined in what you expect of schools. It's possible to do both. Sometimes you'll feel you're a little bit too assertive, and sometimes you're going to acquiesce a little too much. Right. It's a bit of the razor's edge. You have to be right in the middle with this. Persistent but polite is one way to put it. Right.
So you're getting lots of questions into some like specifics for IPRCs. One here is for a question we get all the time around toilet training. So could this parent's request toilet training be put into the IPRC?
Yes, it can.
Yeah.
But I'll take a few steps back. First, obviously, it depends on the child. Depends on how old the child is. And ultimately, it's going to depend, for you to be successful at this, advocating for some sort of continence training program. Right. I looked that up recently because I just didn't want to say potty trained all the time. Yeah. But for you to be successful at it, it'd be really helpful to have an outside expert that has the right to have an opinion based on their qualifications. So, for instance, a doctor, person from the autism services that you have within the community. Perhaps you're running a toilet training, a continence training program. That is something schools do. It's mentioned in documents. It's mentioned likely in your school's special ed plan. And we'll be talking about that. Yeah, that's well within the range of something you could be asking for.
I just realized that's actually something we didn't highlight again. We have an example of a school board's education plan with these resources. We have the Parent's Guide to Special Education for the Toronto District School Board. Every school board is required to have one available to parents. So it's important for everyone listening that they are able to get on their school board's website and get a hold of their own Parent's Guide to Special Education.
So there's two pieces to this that you'll find, because it is a bit confusing.
Right.
There's the Parent's Guide to Special Ed Programs and Services is great. That's like a 20, 30-page thing, and fairly easy to read. They won't have anything about toilet training in it. But the other document that also exists is a thing called your board's special ed plan, and it's big. Like it's 300-400 pages, but in that it talks about all the programs and services that the board provides, and toileting is one of them.
Right.
And we've included the Toronto District School Board's special ed
Parent's Guide
and the special ed plan. Just because it's the biggest board, and to be really blunt, they write very, very exhaustively and concise. But whatever's in the TDSB special ed plan should likely be in any special ed plan in any school board in the province.
Okay. We have time for one last question today, Ed. This parent asks, at my son's last IPRC meeting, I was told that he needs psychoeducational assessment to identify placement. However, I was told there is no guarantee he will get one before he starts middle school, since there's only one psychologist for several schools. And I know this is the reality for a lot of parents. This is a long wait list to get psychological assessments.
So I'm going to be measured in how I answer this.
Okay.
Right? If a school has indicated that that program and service is needed for to make educational decisions about your child, they at that point really have lost the ability to then say that you have to wait for long periods of time because of financial reasons. In fact, I'm wondering if that's actually in writing.
Right.
You know, I would probably document that.
Okay.
Because what a lot of people just to go back on this, what a lot of people will do at that point when they hear that there's a waiting list is these are expensive tests, but they can be done privately, and it's several $1,000s. But a lot of people do that, and they circumvent the system in that way, and we're happy, because that's great, you're doing that, and that's one way around that. If you were going to do that, be sure that it's a person that has the qualifications to do that, right? That it's a psychologist or a person that can do that test. But I would give some thought to even there's a way to advocate for the board for that test now that they've said that the test is necessary for your child educationally. And there's just a way to do that. And likely, again, the easiest way is to do this through the IPRC process. That's how you would start it. He has a need. They've suggested a program and service. You would bring that up that I want to talk about that in an IPRC, and then it's going to become very hard for us to say, now that we've said they need it, to pull back on financial reasons. And I'm dipping into, sort of petty legal things, but it basically just becomes a human rights argument. And I'm not a lawyer, but lawyers would tell you that autism is a disability under the Act, and the board is obligated to provide needed program and service up to the point of undue hardship, and the board can't really claim financial undue hardship. So take that as it may.
Right.
You have something there.
Right. So here we are at the end, and we're so grateful that you could spend this time with us, Ed. This has been a really, really great workshop, and we're so thankful for everyone that's asked their questions today, too. There's a couple of things. The first thing I just wanted to do was remind everybody about the resources that are available in the resource deck. The second thing that I wanted to do was give Ed a chance to talk a little bit about what's coming up next for us, and then also just to give us a little bit of a recap about today and sort of some final thoughts about leading up to the IPRC.
Yeah, okay. I thought I put the webinar you just saw in a context, because we're developing this as we're doing it. So the way I imagine the first piece is these are sort of the procedures that lead up to an IPRC, and it's also where you have rights and traction, right? And you can see what we're saying with that. I think the second webinar, in looking at it, I'm probably going to spend the entire webinar just looking at intellectually how an IPRC works, how the components work, and how you need to create kind of a flow of how your child's needs and programs and services, and that you really, really understand that, so that you can project that at the meeting and project that in writing. And then I'm thinking the last webinar, the way it looks to me is then we'll look at, that's an internal process, intellectually, that you understand how this all works. The next piece will be emotionally, because in some ways that might even be bigger, that you need to know what works in meetings like this and what doesn't, and how to consider responding when roadblocks are put up in front of you, because there's some really productive ways to respond and there's some less productive ways to respond. So to go back, it's interesting. we have never made it to the meeting yet. You know, we've talked about the process to get in, the sort of the intellectual piece we'll talk about in the next webinar, and then the emotional piece.
Okay.
And then hopefully this gives people enough for the meeting.
Right. Right. Well, we want to set everybody up for September and have them feeling strong and empowered. And yeah, we're really grateful you could do this for us today. So just a reminder to everybody, our session 2 is next Tuesday, August 22nd, again at 12 p.m. We're just so grateful for all of your questions today, and we're grateful, Ed, that we could have you today to answer them. Thank you, and we'll join you again next Tuesday.